So hello everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Postnatural Studies. Thanks for joining us tonight in a conversation with Michael Wang. Hi, Michael. And this is a talk that is part of our online sessions that are included in our seminar, Postnature and Contemporary Creation. So the Institute for Postnatural Studies is understood as a platform for artistic experimentation from which we explore and problematize the idea or the concept of postnature as a framework for contemporary creation, thinking, and artistic practices. And we are very happy to have Michael today because we think his work is very aligned with the interest of our platform. I just want to say hello also to all the participants of the seminar who will be there watching live. And remember that you can all make questions, comments, or whatever you want in the chat of the video. Michael will start a presentation of his work, and then we will have a conversation between us, and I will pass him your questions. Just a brief, short presentation of Michael. He's an American artist based in New York. He studied social anthropology and visual and environmental studies in Harvard University, a master's in performance studies from New York University, and master's in architecture from Princeton University. And his early works, you will see in the presentation, include a series called Rivals, or the very interesting work Carbon Copies, which represents carbon footprints of very well-known artists. He will tell you more about this, I guess. And I find his recent work very fascinating. He has developed a very speculative approach and practice towards art, becoming a kind of contemporary botanist or alchemist that creates or brings back to life extinct species. Works or exhibitions like Extinct in the Wild, for example. This installation that you presented in Fondazione Prada in Milan, I think it was 14. And he brought species of plants and animals that are no longer found in nature, but that persist under human care. Then he joined Manifesta in Palermo, this beautiful project in Italy, and he presented The Drowned World, a fascinating landscape connecting ancient organic processes, climate change, and exhibiting bacteria, a carboniferous landscape. And another recent exhibition that I found very, very beautiful is Extinct in New York. He will tell you more about this. Where he brought also extinct species that are no longer growing in the city, and he brought them back to life. So for me, his work can help to stabilize the very still anthropocentric notion of the world we have, and more specifically in the art practice. And I think he proposes this multi-species perspective, and this is something we will discuss after the presentation. He can help blur the lines between what is natural and what is artificial, and creating new worlds for speculative landscapes between art, science, and imagination. So I'm super happy to have you, Michael, with us here. Thanks for participating in this event. I will let you now with the word and the screen, and see you after your talk to the conversation, inviting all the people to make comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having me. Your group, the focus of your group is so interesting and so important. And I think your concerns overlap so much with a lot of the concerns of my work. I've titled the presentation today, not post-nature, but techno-nature, because I'll be focusing on projects that in some way deal with the overlap or intersection of technology and natural systems. But I think I should caution that technology isn't just the domain of humans, and nature is not only a space for the non-human, that there will be kind of interpenetrations here. And since I work as an artist, I just wanted to start with a really quick art historical take on two kinds of practices that I think inform a lot of what I do. So on the left, I have Michael Heiser's double negative, kind of standing in for American land art. And on the right, I have Hans Hacke's condensation cube, which is standing in for institutional critique. And I think these two practices, both these works are from the 1960s, are very interesting because of their approach to what art could be and their approach to traditional art institutions. So on the one hand, you have land artists saying, we want to escape the confines of the gallery or the museum and go out into nature. And then you have institutional critique saying, let's look at the context in which art is displayed. Condensation cube is responsive to the climatic conditions of the gallery. It kind of affects how those beads of condensation form. I think for me, I see the kind of boundaries of the gallery or museum as sort of necessarily permeable. And so I'm taking some of the kind of critical tools from a tradition like institutional critique, but now applying those to the interconnections between cultural systems and natural systems, the kind of overlap of those two. And the first work I'm going to talk about, I think, does a kind of a good job of making those connections clear. And this is a series I started almost 10 years ago called Carbon Copies. This was a kind of, I was trying to mimic here like an art forum ad for an exhibition. But here I'm listing out a number of artists for whom I've calculated the carbon footprint for a particularly iconic work that they produced. So I took a collection of kind of very well-known, very highly visible contemporary artworks, and I found a way to calculate what the carbon footprint of those works was, either through the production of the work or the display of the work. And so for the first exhibition of these, which is shown in a commercial gallery, I worked with 20 works by 20 artists and determined those 20 carbon footprints. So this connection now between an artwork, often quite traditional artworks, and their kind of impact in the atmosphere was already for me drawing a line between what happens in the world of art and what happens in the kind of wider world, in this kind of global ecological context. Then what I did on the right is what I'm calling a carbon copy. I reimagined these works in the form of cubes. And those cubes were scaled according to the volume of carbon dioxide that was released in their production or presentation. And I scaled them, they were quite small and mostly just made out of very simple materials. The scale was 1 to 5 million. So you can imagine the volume, the actual volume there would have been much, much larger than these works, but you could read them, their kind of relative footprints in relationship to each other. And then on the left, all of these images and text were in a kind of a version of an exhibition catalog. On the left is a kind of story that tells how I calculated the emissions of that work. So for Jan Vo's We the People, I found that the entire work required 31 tons of copper sheet. And I was able to determine that to fabricate 31 tons of copper sheet would release a little over 84 tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And every calculation was different because all these works are very different. This was a calculation for Vanessa B. Cross BB64, which was a performance piece. And so instead of looking at the kind of embodied material, here I found out that as part of that work, Kanye West had flown in by private jet from Paris Fashion Week to New York to make the video for the work. And so I calculated the carbon emissions from that flight by private jet, which was 22.16 tons of carbon dioxide. But for me, it wasn't just about kind of visualizing these, what I consider these kind of these shadow versions of the works, the kind of the versions of the work that exist invisibly in the atmosphere, the carbon footprints. It wasn't just about showing those. I also wanted to point to the atmosphere itself as a place where artists could work, could actually appropriate the atmosphere as a medium. And so once I calculated these footprints and created these carbon copies that represent those carbon footprints, I had them for sale. But they were for sale in exchange for certified carbon offsets. I worked with a carbon offset company based in France to fund a set of projects that would ostensibly erase those carbon footprints through the purchase of these works. So for me, that was actually the real kind of end goal of the project, was this gesture of erasure. And I think also for me, it was a way of pointing to a new way of working as an artist, not just to only kind of represent things, to model things, but to actually work with the atmosphere, and by extension, potentially other ecological systems, as a kind of medium and site. And here you can see a selection of all the different carbon copies in relationship to each other. A couple of years ago, for Manifesta, I kind of returned to themes of climate change for this work, series of work called The Drowned World. And for The Drowned World, I wanted to kind of reveal the often unseen organic origins of fossil fuels. And I focused in on coal. I wanted to show the kind of lost world that coal emerged out of. Not just to think of climate change as something abstract, but something that's actually also very material, and rooted in this kind of biological material. And so I found a selection of fossils of the ancient plant forms that formed the coal forest 300 million years ago in the Carboniferous period. And I made these photographs that were, to me, kind of in a modernist idiom, almost as a way to restore this kind of biological world to the imagery of modernity. So not just inorganic materials like glass and steel, but to see that actually these living organisms are kind of at the origin and root of modernization and industrialization. This is a Myriopterous fern, a kind of fern that was prevalent in these Carboniferous forests. And a lot of these are imprints either in coal or in sediments that were alongside coal deposits. This is a Lepidodendron imprint, and this is a kind of plant related to club mosses, but at this time they would grow into the size of huge trees. And another fern. The Carboniferous forest existed before the evolution of flowering plants. So they're all non-flowering plants, spore-bearing plants. But I also wanted to bring this kind of paleobotanical research to life. And again, to kind of not just represent these forests, but actually kind of engage with the kind of ecological systems that these forests were a part of. So I was lucky enough to be able to work at the site of a coal gas plant. So actually a part of this kind of fossil fuel infrastructure. And here at the site of this coal gas plant, I recreated as closely as I could a living Carboniferous forest. So I sourced plant species that are related to these ancient plants, ferns, cycads, tree ferns, araucarias, all of these kinds of plants that are related to those ancient forms. And I created this forest that appears to emerge out of the ruins of this coal gas plant. And for me, I like to imagine almost a kind of a science fiction element to this, thinking about the carbon system, and imagining that at one time, these Carboniferous forests captured all of this carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and stored it underground, where it became coal. But that over the last several hundred years, a few hundred years, as coal has been vaporized, the remains of those forests have been returned to the atmosphere. And I was speculating, as these forests are returned to the air, an ancient atmosphere is actually being restored. In turn, these forests could emerge again, potentially, in this kind of changed climate. So it's a kind of speculative, kind of science fiction version, imagining the return of these forests. And I drew the title of the series, The Drowned World, from a J.G. Ballard short story and novella, where he's also imagining the return of these ancient forests due to a kind of climate change. I also made another work as part of this series outside of the forest, where I cultivated cyanobacteria in a decorative pool. this decorative pool was kind of existing near the site. And I was interested in showing cyanobacteria because to me, they kind of exemplify the processes of photosynthesis. Cyanobacteria were the very first photosynthetic organisms that use chlorophyll to capture carbon dioxide and create atmospheric oxygen. And what's so interesting to me about cyanobacteria is that when cyanobacteria emerged, atmospheric oxygen was produced in large quantities for the very first time. This was maybe 2 billion years ago. And that change, kind of instigated by these organisms, actually resulted in maybe the largest mass extinction event in the history of the Earth. Because all of the microbes that had evolved on the Earth up till that time, most of them couldn't handle an oxygenated environment. It was actually very toxic to these organisms. And so there was a mass die-off of so many kinds of microorganisms. But of course, it is only because the atmosphere contains oxygen that organisms like ourselves were able to even emerge in the first place. And to me, there are some very interesting parallels to think about an organism that can change the atmosphere globally, just as humans are able to do today as well. And I think of this as a kind of a living monochrome. It's a way of sort of bringing back this first green, since the Earth before this time would have been shades of reds and purples and grays. There wasn't a living green like there is today. And then next is just a video showing the context of the forest in relationship to the ruins of this disused gas plant. So the site was very much a part of the work. The next work I'm talking about is Extinct in the Wild. And this is also an ongoing series. Like many of my works, they take on many different forms. They kind of continue. But for Extinct in the Wild, I was bringing together flora and fauna that are no longer found in what's considered a natural state, but they persist in cultivation or captivity. There's an official conservation designation, Extinct in the Wild, that names these species. And what's so interesting to me is that these species are not actually extinct. They persist, but they've kind of shifted the environment in which they can survive. They can survive now only in this relationship with human species. And I think to me, what was also interesting was to think that in a way, they've kind of left nature behind in order to enter fully into these circuits of culture. And so I was also thinking about the kind of theories of the ready-made, that a ready-made is something taken from mass culture and kind of elevated and taken into a space of high culture. And I was thinking about the kind of cultural domains that these species persist in. It's horticulture, agriculture, the pet trade, all these different spheres of culture. And for me, they were now available to be, like the ready-made, taken into a space of high culture. And so this was first shown at the Fondazione Prada in Milan. And here I constructed a number of greenhouses that became these sort of life support systems for a number of these species designated extinct in the wild. And to me, that kind of changed also the meaning of an art institution, that it's not just a place for traditional artworks or kind of rare artifacts, but that actually these living organisms were deserving of a kind of attention and appreciation and care that we maybe traditionally would afford to the products of traditional human craft and artistry. That now these were a kind of cultural artifact that could be presented in this kind of a context. And I think I was also, I was thinking about the kind of origins of curation as a practice and thinking about its root in cura, which means care, and imagining that the care also afforded artworks or rare manuscripts. The curator of a library could now be extended to caring for a species that actually only persists under human care. So the gallery itself actually becomes another kind of node in these often very global systems of care that are the only places where these species now exist. And some were very rare. For example, this is a species, Encephalartos nubimontanus, the kind of blue cycad, that's actually very uncommon in cultivation, but is extinct in the wild in South Africa. And it's really maintained by collectors of rare cycads and in botanical collections. But we were able to display one here before it then went on to a botanical garden in Milan. But other species are incredibly common in captivity or cultivation. So this is a red-tailed black shark that's actually very common in the pet trade as an aquarium fish, but it's no longer found in the wilds of Thailand in the river basins where it once was found, even though in Thailand it's actually bred in thousands, probably millions for the pet trade, but only now in this very managed kind of human environment and context. And here, these are two leucistic, very pale formed axolotls, which I had to kind of develop my own kind of system sometimes for describing what counts as extinct in the wild. So even though these are not officially designated extinct in the wild, they're very, very rare and have sometimes been kind of described as extinct in nature in the remains of Lake Xochimilco in Mexico City. But what's so interesting about Lake Xochimilco is it really is a kind of series of artificial canals that were built in Aztec times. So this environment that they remain in is kind of, even from ancient times, a kind of human-made and artificial environment. And in that sense, I felt that they only, for a long time now, have existed in a kind of human-made environment. But the ones that are found in that more kind of semi-wild state tend to be a very dark color, whereas the axolotls that are bred in the tens, hundreds of thousands in captivity are often this white form. And they're also bred for scientific research because they have really interesting properties. They can regrow limbs. They're constantly in this kind of neotenic state where they're not actually undergoing metamorphosis. They're quite interesting. And just another iteration of Extinct in the Wild here. This was at the Swiss Institute in New York, where it actually just took the form of a roof garden. So I selected 4 species of plants that are only known in cultivation and not, in the wild context, and created this roof garden that is also an artwork that's kind of perpetually under the care then of the Swiss Institute, which is a contemporary art venue in New York City. These are ginkgos, which is, again, a very common species in cities. It's used in urban landscaping very frequently because it's very resistant to pollutants, but it's not known in a wild state. All of the populations that are often very, very old are associated with humans in some way. They were often planted at temples in China and in other areas in the Far East. And they were also planted for a long time at grave sites. This is a species from North America called Franklinia alatamaha. It was only ever recorded as very, very rare, and grew in one very small region in what's now the US state of Georgia. And it's thought that it disappeared from its wild environment with the introduction of cotton cultivation, that this brought new kinds of fungal diseases that decimated the species. But it was collected in the 18th century, and it's been kind of kept alive in horticulture and in the kind of ornamental plant trade since that time. Another aspect of this project is I have been making almost these pilgrimages to the last known wild site for these species. And sometimes this is a bit speculative. For example, this is in the Dala Mountains near Chongqing in China, which is presumed to be the last wild location for the ginkgo because there's the greatest genetic diversity in ginkgo trees in this area. But here I visited a kind of old graveyard where these very, very old ginkgo grew in the Dala Mountains. But then I'm also documenting the same species in their kind of new captive or cultivated context. And so this is a ginkgo planted in a new area in Chengdu in Western China. This is the last site where a species known as Brighamian cygnus, or the alula, was collected in Hawaii. It's in Kauai on the Na Pali coast. And this species probably went extinct in the wild because its pollinator either vanished or has become very, very rare. It's speculated to be a kind of hawk moth. So it only persists now when it's hand pollinated by humans, first by conservationists at this site, but now it's actually entered into the houseplant trade. And this is a greenhouse in the Netherlands where they're cultivating thousands of Brighamia and cygnus, thousands of miles from where this species evolved, and they're being sold all over the world. So there's been this kind of displacement here from the kind of environments in which these species evolved to now being kind of displaced into these often very, very dispersed and global human contexts. I did a residency in Hawaii where I was able to record a number of these sites in Hawaii because islands are often very interesting places because they have such unique flora and fauna, but they're also so vulnerable to change. And in Hawaii, many, many species have become extinct, but also many species have become extinct, but then in some way preserved often through conservation programs, either in zoos and botanical collections. So this is a site where the Hawaiian crow, Corvus hawaiiensis, was last observed in the wild in the 1990s. It's actually a ranch called the McCandles Ranch. It's on the Big Island of Hawaii. And this is one of the very, very few remaining Hawaiian crows in captivity in a breeding facility that's also on the Big Island of Hawaii. This is Tenerife in the Canary Islands. And this is the last location where a plant called Lotus Birch Lotii was found growing wild. And even when it was collected in the 19th century, it was observed as very, very rare. And this is also speculated that it disappeared because of the extinction of some unknown pollinator, which is presumed to be a kind of bird, maybe a kind of Canarian sunbird. But it was collected and it's actually been quite commonly cultivated. And this is the species here growing in the garden of a church, also on the same island. And sometimes the change in these environments is invisible. For example, with the disappearance of a pollinator, it's not something you recognize in the landscape, but sometimes the changes are very, very visible. This is a dam in Taipei in Taiwan, and the dam was built at the only known location of a species of azalea, Rhododendron kanahirae, that used to grow in kind of the marshy areas around this river. And when the river was dammed, it completely flooded the entire area where this species grew. But because this was in the 1980s and they were able to repair, they collected a number of these plants and have been propagating them. And they've now actually planted them ringing the reservoir that has completely flooded their former habitat. And one last story, this is the Tizi and Tishka Pass in Morocco. And this is a location where in 1942, the last known Barbary lion, a subspecies of lion, was shot and killed. And this species has quite an interesting history. Would have been the kind of lion that would have been imported by the thousands to the Roman Colosseum. Their They were known from what is now Algeria, Morocco, Egypt, but they've, since 1942, they've no longer existed in the wild. But there is a collection of lions that traces some of its lineage to the royal collections of the kings of Morocco, who would keep these Barbary lions in their menageries. And this collection is here at the zoo in Rabat, the capital of Morocco. They actually keep 5 male lions in a kind of enclosed area off of a conference room where they host events. And these are those lions looking out the windows of this conference room. And the last project I'll talk about is called Extinct in New York. And this draws on a lot of the same themes as Extinct in the Wild, but I zeroed in on New York City. I live just outside the city now, but it's a city that I've lived in for many years and know very well. And I was looking at the impacts of urbanization on natural history of New York City. And in a similar process, in a similar way to doing this kind of background research and making these sorts of pilgrimages to the last observation sites around the world for Extinct in the Wild, here I worked with the New York Botanical Garden to, first of all, create a list of species that were recorded historically from New York City or the areas that became New York City, and then to compare that with species that are identified growing kind of in an autonomous state in the city today, in order to figure out which species have been kind of extirpated from New York City. Once I had that list, I went to the botanical collections housed at the Botanical Garden, and I found the last known collected specimens from New York City for each of these species. And I created these drawings in watercolors that are based on the last collections from New York City. So this species is Yersinia schreberi, also known as the water shield. And after I made these drawings based on these specimens, these kind of dried, sometimes 100 or more year old specimens, I went to the locations where they were collected, because that data is included with these herbarium specimens, to see what they look like today and to document their spaces today. So this is in Staten Island in New York, where Yersinia schreberi was last collected. And this is what that location looks like today. And then similar to Extinct in the Wild, sometimes these locations are parks. They're places you might imagine living things, living plants could persist today, but in some invisible ways, sometimes these environments change. For example, like change in water quality might not be visible, but it could affect which species can actually persist in these locations. This is Helianthus angustifolius, also known as a swamp sunflower. And it was last collected in 1908 in New York Avenue in Brooklyn. And this is what New York Avenue looked like last year. This is Epigaya repens, a Trallinger butis. This is an interesting species because it actually became an important symbol of very early conservation efforts, because it has these kind of very fragrant white or pale pink flowers in the springtime. They're very popular Victorian buttonhole ornaments, but they were over-collected and they grow very, very slowly until they actually disappeared from many areas. And people noticed, and they actually started kind of early conservation movements around this species. This was last collected also in Staten Island in an area called Prince's Bay. Like Staten Island ended up being overrepresented in a way, and I think that's partly because there are many more parks and areas that weren't developed as much as the rest of the city, so things kind of were able to hang on there for longer. But it's also because historically many botanists lived in Staten Island, and so they were actually making more collections there. There might be a kind of collection bias around that too. This is the species of Clematis ochroluca, curly heads. And it was last collected in 1934 in Grant City in Staten Island on these serpentine cliffs that are now have these like mansions. Capnoides sempervirens, pink corydalus. And this was last collected in Bronx Park in the Bronx in 1940. And Zostera marina, eelgrass. This species is very susceptible to water quality because it it needs to its roots grow in loose gravel and sand. And since New York Harbor and Bay have become heavily kind of contaminated with nitrogen runoff, there's this kind of black organic muck now at the bottom, and it's actually not a substrate that eelgrass can grow in. And this was last collected in Jamaica Bay in 1883. And the Jamaica Bay is in Queens, and you can look out and you can see very, very faint on the horizon there, the skyline of Manhattan. After identifying these species, I was propagating a selection of them, over 40 species in my studio and garden, some from seeds, some from seedlings, and I was documenting them as they would come into flower, as they would come into seed, because the work was really, it was about the process. It was a changing work. It was, I wanted to revive in a way these species that are no longer found in, within the limits of New York City, and return them to the city. But that process of growing and reviving these species was a part of the work, and I wanted to document that. This is a species of orchid that grows in bogs. A lot of bog and wetland species have disappeared from New York City because so much of the city was drained for development. Arrangium aquaticum. This is also a kind of salt marsh species. And Carrick grayi, gray sag, which also grows in moist wetland areas. I spent about a year growing these species before staking an exhibition where I returned these species to the city. So I was growing them about 25 miles from the city where I have my studio. And for this exhibition on Governor's Island, which is an island just off Manhattan, I created a series of these greenhouses that form these kind of protective enclosures. They were humidified, had artificial lighting in them, where I could temporarily display these 40-some species. But it was more than just displaying these species, it was for me actually a little kind of return. But for me, this idea of return is very ambivalent, because these species are being returned, but only on this kind of life support that they need. And I kind of wanted to show that in a way through the exhibition as well, that it's only through the kind of intervention now of these technologies of care that the species can actually persist in the changed environment that was once their kind of native land. And I think what's also interesting about the history of New York City is that the history of the city is also the history of colonialism, of industrialization, of capitalism, and all of the effects of those processes have an impact on the ecology of the city itself. And so the story of these species actually tells those stories as well. I think something else that's quite interesting is to think about the different kinds of relations that humans can have with other species, non-human species. And I learned through this project that the indigenous land management practices in Manhattan and the rest of New York, previous to the arrival of Europeans, actually resulted in a net kind of increase in biodiversity, because the Lenape land management practices created a more heterogeneous landscape. But also there was a kind of an intentional propagation of many, many kind of species for all kinds of reasons, for medicinal purposes, for food, that actually increased the overall diversity of the New York City area over what it would have been without any kind of human habitation. And for me, this was not just a project to kind of catalog the loss of these species in the city. It was envisioning that by bringing them back, we might imagine a city that's designed to accommodate the very species that the growth of the city originally displaced. So imagining a city that kind of allows back this, this kind of natural heritage, this other kind of diversity. This is a kind of lichen, beard lichen. It's almost hard for me to imagine this used to grow in New York. And apparently they would grow from these old growth hemlocks that are kind of long gone for most of New York. And the lichenologist I worked with in bringing the species back had a couple theories as to why it disappeared. One is that lichens are very, very susceptible to air quality. And when coal began to be burned at a large scale in New York City, most of the large lichens in the city disappeared. But they also require these very, very high humidity. And there are records that say that in New York City, there used to be these coastal fogs that would come through almost every morning, but that those just don't happen anymore. And the lichenologists speculated that the decrease in vegetation in New York has actually just kind of brought down the humidity levels. So that's changed the kind of microclimate of the city. He thinks just not only just the vegetation itself, but even the quantity of lichens that used to be kind of clinging to all of these trees would kind of hold in moisture and created just a very different environment and weather system than we know in New York today. The kind of algae that grew in the waters around New York also, many of them vanished at a very specific point in time, which was when a very large aquifer north of the city was let in fresh water much more quickly and efficiently than ever before. Suddenly, much more water was being flushed out of the city. And that meant all kinds of waste was being flushed into the waterways around New York, and it completely changed the chemistry of the water. And around that time is when a lot of these algae started to disappear. And these are just some images that are showing some of the plants coming into bloom, kind of persisting temporarily in these artificial environments. At the end of the exhibition, I worked with some of the gardens and parks in New York City so that they could kind of adopt these plants and kind of restore them to the fabric of the city itself. So there was this kind of homecoming, but again, they're not living in a wild context anymore in New York City. They are being tended to by these gardeners in various parks in the city. That's my last slide.
Not working. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Michael. That was very beautiful trip, like a very atemporal and very inspiring trip. I am gonna check the comments and the questions, but I just wanted to start with a couple of questions and ideas that your work makes me think about. And I'm really very interested in the way your work deals with the idea of extinction, how plants, flowers, and how they can become more than only aesthetic devices, but actually, as you were saying, stand for actual strategies of survival. And in this way, I think that confronts ourselves with the notion of the end of the world, or an end of the world as we know it. And I think art, and your art specifically, can destabilize the still very anthropocentric notion that we have towards the world. And therefore, what I was saying before, at the beginning, is you're proposing new multispecies perspective. And is that something you think about? What is your relation with both, with the idea of a kind of post-anthropocentric perspective in art practices, but also a new relation with the concept of extinction of the end or of the end of the world?
Yeah, really interesting question. I think that so many conversations around conservation always have an aesthetic component as well. And I think that extinction in particular has all of these aesthetic resonances and is often spoken about in that kind of way. And sometimes you find that when a species is declared extinct, it actually gains a new kind of visibility. And I think I'm interested in those kinds of the aesthetics of conservation, but I'm also very interested in complicating those aesthetics. And so, for example, when I'm looking at extinction in these last couple of projects, I'm looking at these very ambivalent categories of extinction. And extinction in the wild is not the disappearance of a species. It's more the kind of displacement of a species. The same with extinct in New York, it's a kind of a local extirpation. And so in a way, I think in these kind of less clear-cut forms of extinction, it can be a place to kind of maybe more fully kind of question what extinction even means. And also to kind of foreground the kind of different aesthetic approaches that we have, the kind of tools for understanding and making sense of an extinction event. When it comes to a kind of multi-species approach, I mean, that's just, it's sort of, it's the starting point for me, that it's kind of impossible for me to think about the human species in isolation. And I mean, in so many kind of fundamental ways. Even just the makeup of the human body itself is heterogeneous and made out of many species of microbe. It's kind of impossible to use a species logic to kind of isolate out the human body itself. So I'm kind of already entangled, kind of necessarily, like anyone in this kind of multi-species universe. I do think that I often draw from the kind of scientific, technological tool sets. Even the definition of a species itself is a very kind of scientific definition, but it's also one that doesn't necessarily hold up to scrutiny. The kind of the boundaries of a species can be very, very unclear. But I often begin with these sort of known or kind of scientifically determined categories like a species, even as I'm acknowledging that those start to break down. So I'm sort of appropriating sometimes systems from the world of science or technology, but then I hope presenting them in such a way that allows for a kind of critical discourse around those very systems. And when you mention things like the Anthropocene or the post-Anthropocene, to me, the very kind of ideas around the Anthropocene are so closely tied to this kind of scientific, systemic, technological discourse. And that's very important to my work. I think it's something that is often a kind of starting point or something that I want to look at, even if it's also to interrogate that and to kind of question the kind of totalizing logic of some of the kind of systemic discourses that are a part of a kind of general understanding of what even the Anthropocene constitutes.
Yeah, definitely. It's very interesting when you were also saying or speaking about how specific places or cultures also have their own relations to these species, which for me, what do you think about the other kind of narratives that also are embedded in these kind of plants? Because your approach is very scientific and draws attention to those cultural constructs that are science and technology and how we look the world through them. But do you also have an approach towards the other narratives, other mythologies, other ways of approaching these landscapes, these species that are super important for other cultures? And especially when you travel to these amazing, beautiful places that I'm sure they have other constructs, no, other narratives around them.
Yeah. So for example, in Extinct in the Wild, I'm starting with this term that's taken from a kind of scientific discourse of conservation, extinct in the wild. I'm using that term and using it to set up a structure for what species I'm kind of turning my attention to. But I think that then once I kind of use that almost as a greater framework, when I go in and look at the specific stories, they're incredibly varied. They almost start to represent every possible relationship that humans could have with another species, whether that's kind of indigenous cultivation, preserving a species, whether that's kind of this sort of large scale kind of agricultural production, maintaining a species, scientific research, preserving a species, like all the kind of possible relationships to the non-human start to kind of be embedded in these stories. And so they become incredibly diverse. And I think all of those different kind of cultural relationships to the non-human are a part of these stories. And my hope is that as I start to kind of flesh these stories out, that the kind of heterogeneity of that experience starts to come through.
Yeah, definitely. And something that also strikes me about your work is the and it connects me with a beautiful aspect of your pieces, of the installations themselves, the relation towards temporality. This is something we've discussed in our conversations, and I remember this what Timothy Morton said, no, like artworks are like thoughts coming from the future, and in this sense, your plants, your seeds, or even the small fishes that you they become like atemporal archaeologies, like creatures that look like they come from prehistoric ages. This is something I read in Ivan's text, Ivan Lopez Monuera, who is a friend of us. He has this beautiful text about your exhibition, and that although we share the same universe, in fact, our bodies encompass very different notions of our surroundings. Like they, like all the things, we don't share the same universe somehow, because we cannot relate to our environments, and our temporalities are unreconcilable. So, but at the same time, we coexist. So are we kind of living in a kind of multiverse? Is that something that you want to also talk about, like these different universes that coexist?
Yeah, certainly. And I think that there might be a kind of very traditional way of thinking about an artwork, thinking about the relationship between an artist and a viewer. And there are usually a lot of assumptions about that viewer. What is that subjectivity? Is that viewer considered human? Those are all things I think about, but I think for me, they're ultimately, and this is not because of the kind of necessarily the grand ambitions of my work, it's just the kind of starting point for any work. It's a very small part of the work in its entirety, because I'm working with these materials that are infinitely connected to other frames of time, other scales of time, to other kinds of biological relationships that kind of exceed any kind of artistic control I might try to exert over them. So in a work like The Drowned World, I'm trying to recreate this carboniferous forest, but the plants I'm using have these millions of years of evolutionary history that is a part of what they are, and are also tied to these chemical processes that are kind of beyond my comprehension and ability to control or create, and are also tied to a vision of what the future might look like. The future kind of atmospheric or botanical kind of surface of the earth. Those are all kind of exceed anything that I have any control over. And so in some sense, these artworks are not made for humans, because I have to take into account all of the other systems and beings and entities that they're tied to.
That's super beautiful, and that makes you part of something that you cannot control at some point. No, like you just are speculating, but they have their own agencies. They communicate in different ways, and it's beautiful to understand also art as something that cannot be totally under control. I love that idea. Yeah,
I can be a very, very tiny agent within these walls.
Yeah, definitely. There are a couple of questions. Well, first, there are a lot of hearts and hellos and thanks. I'm gonna throw some questions, then I have some more. We could be speaking for hours. There is Yuri Tuma. He's saying, "Hi, Michael. Thank you so much for presenting your work. Big fan." And smiley. I wanted to ask you about the extinction in the wild. I was wondering what kind of feelings or emotions you feel when you see the seed that you brought back to life flourishing. I feel this is a work that transits between a transcendental yet perverse act. So I just was wondering how you feel versus how you think about this work, like the emotional part of bringing these species back to life.
Yeah, I have so many mixed feelings. And I think that I often kind of zero in on these categories that elicit very conflicting feelings for me. And so I think on the one hand, there's a kind of melancholy or sadness just thinking about what once was, and the kind of richness of the kinds of life forms that flourished uh, in this city that I feel like I know well, but I don't know these other versions of this area. So there's a kind of melancholy, also a kind of wonder there too at what it once was. At the same time, I love the city today, and it supports all kind of other diversity, all kind of cultural diversity that didn't exist before, and I love that too. And then when I'm bringing something back in this way, I think it brings up, on the one hand, there is a kind of gesture, I think, of hope, of envisioning that we can care for these things that go beyond one version of the human, say. I think I'm kind of hopeful for that, the kind of idea that we could expend some of the great storage of energy that the kind of modern or contemporary city contains, to kind of expend a tiny portion of that to support something that otherwise wouldn't be cared for. So there's a kind of element of a hopefulness there. But at the same time, I found many of these species are very, very fragile. And there's a kind of anxiety around it too. Like, will this thing perish under my care? And there's a kind of feeling of kind of fear and guilt around that too. Basically all of these sort of diverse feelings that I might feel for another living thing. They're all kind of there and present in the work, but in my relationship to it. But I also hope in some way in the kind of new understanding of the city and of these life forms that I hope are embedded in the work itself.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Like, also understanding art as a tool that can arise things like empathy, or it can arise things like care. You said care sometimes during your presentation. I think it's very interesting how care is sometimes out of the art practices. It's just we make some objects, we put them there, and they start like a different economy and temporality, but we don't really take care of them. And the responsibility of bringing back to life some species also demands your care, no? And our care. So I think that's a very, very important tool or concept that you're pointing out. So I think that's a very important agency that you're demanding art to have. No, there are more questions. There are a lot of questions. So Ines, thanks so much, Michael. Was wondering, what is your relation to conservation? This connects with what you were saying. Do you think it's a kind of anthropocentric nostalgia?
Is the question, is conservation anthropogenic nostalgia?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very complicated question. I am a conservationist. I kind of believe that it's important to extend, the kind of energy and care for especially those species that the way I live, in kind of an urban kind of modern way, is in part responsible for. I do feel some sense of responsibility for caring, and in some way, even though it can be very difficult to know the best way to do that, I do feel a responsibility to be a conservationist. Yeah. But I think I understand your question, which is saying, should we try to conserve what once was, or should we look towards a future that understands the future will be very different? And I think I know the future will be different. There's sort of no way to avoid that. The changes that that a certain way of living of a certain set of people have kind of created on the planet will make a different place. I think the question for me is how to make those two things compatible, to ask where can they be compatible. And I think something like Extinct in New York kind of envisioned that. It's saying, okay, maybe these species can't live as they once did in the city. Can I imagine a new way that might sustain these species? And there are many debates among conservationists between what's considered in situ conservation, the sort of conserving something in the place, in its kind of ecological context, in sort of the fullness of that fullness of its kind of intertwined being, rooted in a place, versus ex situ conservation, which might be displaced into a zoo, into a botanical garden, those sorts of things. And I think there are very compelling arguments for both. I think the in situ might be closer to what you're saying as a kind of a nostalgia for a time, almost sometimes an imagined time before humans, because often these species actually lived in relationship to humans, but sometimes it's not always a part of certain conversations in conservation. And then I think some people who are proponents of ex situ conservation see it as sort of a necessary, kind of a necessary, almost like a kind of an emergency room or urgent care for species that otherwise would disappear. And sometimes these two approaches are really at odds, and sometimes there are ways that one supports the other. There, for example, with the Hawaiian crow, that's currently in this kind of ex situ conservation program, but they're experimenting with releasing some back into the wild. I think for my part, I see reintroductions. Some of the species I designated extinct in the wild have been reintroduced, but I sort of, as part of my definition, I consider something that was only surviving because it had been kind of taken totally under human care and reintroduced, still fell into that category. It was once extinct to nature, and its reintroduction now is also somehow tied to a kind of human history. So my definition extended to include that category as well. But so yes, these two things are related, and I think that nostalgia is also a very kind of important emotion sometimes. And I think in so much of my work plays with this idea of return, and it's often motivated by a kind of, sometimes you completely kind of imagine nostalgia for once was and a search for kind of origins, but while acknowledging that to bring something back, it's always bring back change. You can never really go back. And I'm very interested in the different techniques for bringing something back, and also all the meanings that carries when it comes back in a changed form.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's beautiful, no? And we have to maybe also rethink of what nostalgia is, or how we culturally understand it, because it can be a very interesting tool to look back and help us imagine and reshape other possible worlds or futures. So I think it can become, it's true that it's a word or it's a feeling that is very attached to a moment in history, but now we can maybe use it to imagine worlds that are desirable, that we want to live in. So I think that's a very interesting shift that you're doing. I'm going to keep asking you questions from the people watching. So Velasco V888 says, "Gracias, Michael." Thanks, Michael. Once you've given various plants their homecoming, returning them where they came from, do you return them, track them? Do they survive in this time? What is the aftercare like?
Yeah. So with the plants that are returned to New York, I haven't actually been able to keep up with many of them. I've got some updates from the gardeners who had taken them under their care, but I think also I sort of planned to go back and see them more frequently this summer. But in part because of all of the changes with everything, because of the pandemic, I wasn't able to check up on them as much as I had hoped to. So now I'm thinking maybe now it's sort of the fall here, things are going dormant. It might not be till next year that I get to kind of see now how they've established themselves.
Yeah, maybe this is an interesting time for plants. Like we are not so much there out in the streets. We're not polluting so much, and they must be feeling something strange happening out there.
Yeah, I mean, for example, I showed some images of this garden at the Swiss Institute in New York. That I do periodically tend to those plants. Even though they have also a gardener who's more kind of actively caring for the roof garden. But when I last returned, the gardener, because of the pandemic, really hadn't been coming, and to see all of the things that had kind of spontaneously appeared, it was kind of amazing. It's kind of an unusual environment because there's an automatic sprinkler system, so it's very moist there. And so all kinds of wetland plants actually could kind of emerge in different places, and it was interesting to see just that kind of spontaneous generation of a kind of new environment there.
Yeah, definitely. It's super beautiful how you when you put something there is a gardener that has to take care. That's also something that I find very beautiful, how this knowledge of care is transmitted, and someone has to be there. But also the other way around, like when there is no one, other things will happen, other life will come, and the end of the world that we're somehow living will begin other worlds. And like this is the amazing thing about ecosystems, that they just like always changing and adapting, and that's very, very interesting. Like I think your work today is very, very sharp, you know, like very, very, like, yeah. So more questions. Montserrat says, hi Michael, do you use your work, do you used to work next to biologists or scientists to sustain your work, or you just make your personal conclusions and that is okay with you?
Yeah, it's kind of a whole mix. I'm often in conversation with experts. In, like, for example, with Extinct in New York, I worked very closely with a botanist at the New York Botanical Garden to make the assessments, to decide what to include, that sort of thing. So yeah, that was a very close collaboration just to determine the right list of species and to tell the stories properly too, in an informed way. With Extinct in the Wild, the designation is sometimes something I'm playing with in terms of deciding what gets to count, because in a way, you know, if I imagine a lot of what you're talking about is trying to decide, what does it even make sense to make a distinction between what is nature and what is not nature. And the very category extinct in the wild presumes some distinction. You have to say, you know, when has it fully moved out of nature? You have to draw a boundary. So it's necessarily subjective. And so in some cases, I have to figure out where I'm drawing that line to kind of to create a story about why I'm drawing the line there. And it's also something conservationists do, but there's not always consensus. And so I'm often looking at conflicting account of what counts as extinct in nature. And I think it's even more difficult to confirm that something's extinct in the wild than it is to say something's extinct, because when something persists, but you're trying to prove that it persists, but just not in a particular context, it's even a harder thing to find enough evidence to support that for. So like right now, if you look at the IUCN list of species extinct in the wild, it's maybe 60 species. It's not a big list, but probably we can consider that to be much greater. And if you were to extend an idea of what is natural, for example, is a globe under the influence of climate change natural? Maybe every species is extinct in the wild then. So these terms are necessarily somewhat subjective, but once I then go in and start understanding each of these species stories, I'm very often have to talk to experts, because sometimes these are stories that no one's told outside of a very highly specialized scientific discourse. So in order to kind of put the pieces together, I'm very often in conversation with experts.
That's very interesting, how also science is a construct, but you are also approaching your projects from a science fiction approach, and that collision, I find it very interesting, like how these two narratives have to exist together, no? Like science is making reality, is inventing reality, and science fiction is doing the same. So they're like weaving worlds together.
Yeah, and I think they're already connected. So, but I'm kind of finding myself in those connections.
Yeah, that's a very interesting place to be working from. So some other questions. Mateo is asking, hey Michael, what's up? In your projects, your process goes into documenting and research, while next in New York, you represent the plants with drawings, introducing somehow your interpretation of them. Is there a specific reason?
So I'm usually just drawing from all kinds of representational strategies, and there's usually a logic to it. Like, for example, with the herbarium specimens, I was thinking about the kind of history of botanical illustration. But kind of my twist on it here was, instead of representing living species, I was representing these species preserved sometimes for 100 years. So in a way, it was sort of a way of documenting that loss and that kind of historical dimension too. But I was kind of using these traditional techniques from botanical illustration to represent these specimens. I think the one kind of rule I had in that was I was only reproducing the biological material that was preserved. So if you look at these specimens, there's all kinds of labels and text and things that are tied on with string, and I kind of left all those out as a kind of void. So it's only showing the organic material. And yeah, I use photographs as a tool for documentation a lot. And I think about just like the way that photography has been such an important tool in recording things like performance art. These sort of ephemeral productions that only remain in photographs. I think I'm using it often in a similar way of sort of preserving something that is ephemeral.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question also, because it draws attention to how botanists have drawn sometimes the expertise in drawing must have had very also subjective moments where they just were, you know what I mean? Like they were just making things look more beautiful than sometimes they are. And there is also an interpretation in every kind of documentation. So
for sure. And I think also with botanical illustration, their focus is on certain key physical features that are used in identification and species differentiation. So like the sexual organs of a plant will be probably represented in a way that's more kind of diagrammatic and clearly differentiated than you might, than it would look like just to sort of observe a specimen in life.
Yeah, definitely. I have a couple of more questions, and I think it's already almost 9 here in Madrid. So from the Institute for Postnatural Studies, we always try to find examples, artists, texts, visions that help us dismantle this or blur this distinction between the natural and the artificial. This is something that clearly happens in your art, like in the Wild, for example. You're bringing together flora and fauna that are no longer found in nature, but they persist only through human care within an artificial habitat. Do you think art can really become such a tool that can help us definitely break these binary oppositions?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that, I think the reason I'm working in an artistic space is because I'm very interested in how we represent the world and how we understand it, how we experience it. And for me, all of the kinds of conceptual categories that we use to understand the world are expressed also through artworks. And I think that in my work, I'm often not just kind of beginning with a place where these categories are necessarily blurred, though they kind of necessarily will be. I'm often starting with some of the kind of inherited frameworks, as I said, from the scientific discourse, from these kind of modern discourses that actually do rely sometimes on these kinds of categorizations, systems, all of these sort of hard lines drawn between one category versus another. But I think that a lot of my approach, and this is I think what it means for me sometimes to be critical, start to interrogate those categories, to kind of push at those boundaries where you start to see where they start to fall apart. But sometimes for me, it's sort of necessary to start with that system and structure in order to see that dissolution. Because without that starting point, sometimes it's harder to kind of orient that understanding in order to see that dissolution when you don't start with the hard line and then soften it.
Yeah, definitely. I totally agree. And I think this complex moment we are living right now is demanding new ways of thinking and working and doing, maybe proposing these new relations between art and other practices and disciplines. So when you work with these scientists, do they also play a role in the creative processes, or they're just like technicians helping you to understand how species disappear or can be brought back to life, or they somehow also take part in the creative process? Like is the art a kind of negotiation between or conversation between all the parts that take part in it, or it's just like you need this technical
there's so many kinds of collaboration, so I think it's kind of all of the above depending on the work. Maybe the most collaborative work I did with a scientist was I worked with a stem cell researcher, and I really went into that project not knowing what I was going to produce. But I visited her in her lab. She explained her research to me. I was very interested in what she was doing, but I needed to learn more about it. And she was very generous with her time, showed me the different techniques she used. Her work, she started with these artificially produced stem cells that were these sort of reprogrammed skin cells that then could differentiate into ostensibly any cell in the adult human body. And she was explaining to me the way that she was developing these techniques to kind of force a certain kind of program differentiation of these different cells. And through this kind of collaborative learning from her, I kind of worked very closely with her to create a set of images that were based on her microscopic images of these kind of grids of these artificially produced cells. And then I kind of wanted to find an artistic parallel for this. So I was thinking the way she differentiated these cells remind me of the ways that in color theory, you can mix an infinite number of pigments from a starting point of 3. And so I created a pigment mixing system that would produce as many colors as there are cell types in the adult human body, according to her research. And I used that to kind of deploy that across these, they were monochrome microscope images to kind of show the kind of generation of these different colors that would sort of mimic the differentiation of these cells. And then whenever I would display these, I would use the works as the basis for 2 gallery talks. And the scientist, she would give a talk about her work using these cells as a kind of prop. And then I brought in a couple different times a different art historian who would give a talk about the history of color theory. And they would give them simultaneously. So you could never really, you'd have to pick and choose who you would listen to, or else you would be too confused. But it was sort of this kind of maybe not so neat meeting of these 2 disciplines that kind of overlaid the one on the other. But I had to learn so much from the scientist in order to make this work.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think there's just like a comment saying thank you. There is another question, rather more questions, just a couple more. Do you ever feel constrained by the aesthetics of contemporary art and scientific presentation when you choose how to present your projects to the public?
I don't really, I mean, there are all kinds of constraints that I face. Sometimes they're very practical, but I don't feel like there's necessarily, I don't generally feel constrained about like what people are used to seeing. I feel like for me, it's more often what may be interesting for me is looking for overlaps between a kind of form that means something, that's sometimes almost a ready-made form that means something to people in a certain way, but then sometimes filling that with a new content. Sometimes like that's actually very generative for me. And sometimes that means playing with the conventions of contemporary art. I often use a lot of conventions from minimalism as a starting point. But for me, the kind of interesting part is seeing how those might mean something in a new context, and how they might kind of, when kind of migrated to a new medium, mean something and look like something completely different too.
Yeah, totally. There are just one more question. Diego Garcia, no, 2 more questions. Angela is saying, hi, Michael, thank you for joining. You can tell us something about your reference or inspirations, artists, theories, and about how, where are you based, background, thank you.
Okay, yeah. I mean, maybe it's to kind of like to go back to the very beginning of the presentation. I'm very interested in a lot of the practices that emerged in the 1960s and 70s that tried to kind of challenge what art could be. And especially I think about this history of what the critic Jack Burnham called systems aesthetics, of artwork that aspires to be like a system. And I think a lot of my work comes out of that way of working, but at the same time, sort of as I alluded to, I also want to be critical of the systems in a way. Even though I feel like kind of a systems way of thinking really conditions so much of the way kind of the modern subject lives in so many different ways. I also think it's very limited and doesn't accurately kind of represent the kind of fullness and entirety of experience. And so a lot of my work starts there, but I hope that hopefully doesn't end there. It kind of evolves into something else.
Yeah. And the last question from Diego. Hi, thanks, loving it. One question, if not too late. No, it's not too late. Is one motivation of your work to bring back species that are being lost to collective memory? And that's the first condition for caring. And he makes another question. What have you realized are good ways to achieve through transmitting the nostalgia and hope that you feel, for example? So that idea of collective memory, I think is beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting about some of the species that I'm looking at is sometimes there's almost a kind of void in kind of the representation of a certain species in even historical memory. Some of these species are so kind of almost not just forgotten, but almost like they were never fully known. And the structure that I set up to look at a species and care about it and pay attention to it sometimes will make something more visible than it typically is. And this is something I've often found that with a lot of art audiences, when they look at a plant, say, they don't have the knowledge to see the kind of specificity of a particular plant species. They look at a plant and see a plant, or maybe there's some broader category, a flower, but it lacks the kind of particular meaning that it could have, say, from the perspective of a botanist or from a conservationist, where you need to be equipped with a certain kind of knowledge. And so, in some level, I'm hoping that by presenting these things in art contexts, which are places I feel with a kind of a greater sensitivity to not just the way things look, I hope, but just the very existence of something, the very kind of being of something. By putting someone in close proximity to this, I hope that they look closer and care more, and kind of just appreciate being with this thing itself. And that's also why I'm not kind of limiting myself to traditional strategies of representation, drawings and photographs. I like to have the thing itself there, so it's kind of there in all of its richness. So that is very important, the kind of creating this appreciation. And that's not just about kind of resurrecting appreciation or not forgetting. Sometimes it's about seeing it for the first time.
Yeah, definitely. That's beautiful. Alicia is saying that she, as a scientist, has seen her field struggling with all kind of art scientific divulgation, which is often kind of cold. What would you say? What would you say makes a difference between scientific art and divulgation? Well, that's a hard question.
Sorry, what's the second word?
Like what would be a difference between scientific art or divulgation? Like how? I don't understand it. Divulgation is like what? I don't know if this, what would be the word for divulgation? What would you say makes a difference between scientific art? Divulgative is like, there are a lot of questions too. Yeah, disclosure is like the way, so what would you say makes a difference between scientific art and disclosure, or tools that science have to make things visible or communicate things?
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. I mean, so often the aim of scientists is to communicate amongst other scientists. I mean, that's sort of the way that science works. It's sort of the scientific method. And I think that while I'm often taking a lot of knowledge that comes out of scientific domains, I am keeping in mind a different audience. And even sometimes I'm kind of imagining an audience that maybe doesn't even quite exist yet, because they have to care equally about artistic concerns and scientific concerns. These all kind of come together. And so I think for me, I'm communicating with a different end in mind. And it sometimes is more aesthetically motivated. It's about seeing something, appreciating something, understanding something in a larger context. Whereas often science has a very particular set of processes that those scientific modes of communications are kind of in the service of, that they need to be efficient. They need to use specialized language, all these sorts of things. Whereas I have a kind of very different aim.
Yeah, and what I was thinking, you were mentioning approaching different audiences. I was thinking also maybe the bees or the flies that approach these plants that disappeared and somehow they reappeared again and they're there. So what would they think or what would they feel when they encounter a plant that they don't recognize because it was existing? So the different audiences is like really not only human audiences, which is very important of your work too.
Yeah, that's so important. Yeah, that's an amazing idea, is that it's not just for the human viewer. It's the it's a living thing that has a place, even if it's now somewhat displaced, but it will have all of these sort of series of relationships that are just a part of what it means to be a living thing in a context.
Exactly, which is beautiful, and which I think it's something that we really have to think about when making art today. Like, we are coexisting with so many other species that everything we put out there is going to be received and perceived by other many agents. So that's a very beautiful thing. Last, there are many questions. Maite is saying, hi, going back to your first project, carbon copies. She loved it. How do you cope with sustainability in the actual production of your work? What are your boundaries?
Yeah, so I think part of the way that I tried to deal with that is because I didn't want these copies to be carbon intensive. I felt like that would take away from representing the absent work. And so most of them were made of very kind of low energy materials. Most of them I was making at a small desk out of paper, a little bit of glue. A lot of them are shaded just with graphite. Yeah, some of them were made of, somewhat more kind of material things. But even, for example, I made a recreation of Acera, which was tricky because I actually did use steel for that, but I just got a very, very thin almost foil. So it's completely hollow and very lightweight. So the material I used was very, very tiny, but they do have a carbon footprint. I mean, living and breathing has a carbon footprint. So they're not carbon neutral. But at the same time, they're not at a scale yet that I probably could feasibly really offset them though I've thought that eventually, if say I made enough of these, that I could begin to make a calculation that
if you're
large enough to offset it, I could offset this whole project. But I think it's also important for me that sometimes it feels almost like it's kind of moralizing to sort of show what the footprints of these artworks are. And that wasn't really my intent. I think that art in the scheme of things has a tiny carbon footprint compared to any other these huge industries that they're almost incalculable. So the aim wasn't to kind of shame artists for having huge carbon footprints, though I was often picking some artworks that maybe did feel a little bit excessive. So it's not that element maybe is there sometimes and in some ways, but it wasn't the dominant aim. But I'm more just interested in revealing these interconnections, the way that an artwork is tied to the atmosphere in a way that was often not a very highly visible part of these works.
Definitely. Did you get in touch with some of the artists? Did you get any response? Or
I think in a few cases I had to get in touch with their galleries just to get some information about works, but I did it more kind of surreptitiously, not so much.
Yeah, it would be very interesting to see their faces. Okay, so I think that's all. Thank you so much for this for your beautiful work, for your beautiful presentation. It was a pleasure to have you with us. And yeah, please take care. Hope everything goes well there. Today is a very important day, but things might change. I don't know if today or tomorrow, but good luck with that. Fingers crossed. And yeah, let's stay in touch. We will be very, very looking to your next works. What are you working on now? Is there any new projects ongoing?
Yeah, there's a few. I think one of the major ones, I'm continuing my interest in the relationship between energy production and modernity, but turning to not just look at fossil fuels, but look at other modes of energy production, looking at hydropower and also nuclear power.
Wow, interesting. So Michael, take care. Thanks. Everyone is saying thanks for working these things and sharing. From the Institute, we thank you very much for your practice and your time. And yeah, let's keep in touch. Take care.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for all of your attention and questions.
Thank you, Michael. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.